Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the dirt, the heat, and the history of the ancient Near East. We're going to find out what the ancient Israelites actually ate. You know, when you open up the Torah, it's not all just grand narratives about prophets and kings and epic ancient wars. No, we actually find something way more intimate, something literally fundamental to human survival. We find the food right there on their tables. So, what do the ancient Israelites actually eat? Well, to figure that out, we literally have to throw away all of our modern assumptions. Forget the dining rooms, forget the refrigerators, and definitely forget those massive platters of roasted lamb you might be picturing. It is so incredibly easy to just project our current culinary habits backward in time, right? But to truly understand the ancient biblical diet, we've got to rely on a mix of historical texts, archaeology, and solid academic research. Seriously, scrub your mind of stainless steel kitchens, dishwashers, and all that industrial sugar we're used to. The ancient reality was totally different. Picture small hearth fires, ceramic bowls, and bread that literally doubled as your spoon. Meals usually involved a shared central dish, and you just tear off a piece of fresh bread to scoop up your portion. It wasn't a world of 24/7 supermarkets. It was a harsh world where every single calorie had to be pulled directly from the earth with your own hands. And that brings us to the absolute beautifully mundane foundation of ancient survival. Section 1, the ancient everyday table. Now, this is where the true story of ancient cuisine actually begins. It is absolutely fascinating that this one simple word, lechem, proves that bread wasn't just some side dish you ordered before the main course. It was the essential energy source for exhausted agricultural workers. In ancient Israel, the everyday diet leaned heavily, and I mean heavily, on cereals like wheat and barley. If you were sweating out in the fields all day, you weren't cracking open a modern packaged sandwich for lunch. You were surviving on bread, maybe a little vinegar to dip it in, and some roasted grain just to fuel all that intense physical labor. Just imagine the smell of a simple legume stew bubbling over a hearth fire. These specific ingredients mentioned in the book of Exodus show us that things like garlic and onions, they were the everyday flavor base. They weren't exotic luxuries at all. When the Israelites looked back on what they ate in Egypt, this was their flavor world. And even today, if you look at modern Mediterranean and Middle Eastern cuisine, that ancient culinary DNA of garlic, onions, and leeks, it feels remarkably familiar, doesn't it? It's totally foundational. A land flowing with milk and honey. We've all heard this famous phrase describing the promised land. But here's the catch. It represents pastoral abundance, not necessarily a landscape literally covered in beehives. You see, when we hear the word honey, our modern brains instantly jump to bees and those little plastic bear jars of golden liquid. But the ancient reality was actually much more agricultural. So the absolutely crucial point here is that without a massive modern sugar industry, sweetness came from davash. This generally meant dried figs, raisins, and concentrated date syrups. And this wasn't just for a sweet tooth. This was vital survival technology to preserve food through the seasons. Think about it. Fresh fruit spoils incredibly quickly. And without a fridge, drying your fruit was basically mandatory. It wasn't just a fun culinary treat. It was your guarantee that you'd have access to calories and a little bit of sweetness long after the actual harvest was over. Now let's shift our perspective over to the ancient economy, because we really need to understand why meat was a profound rarity. Section 2, the truth about meat. Okay, this is where our modern imagination often gets it very, very wrong. Just because an animal was ritually permitted to be eaten did not mean that ordinary everyday households could actually afford to slaughter and eat it. Being kosher simply meant it was allowed by the rules. But the harsh economic reality, that's what actually dictated what made it to the dinner table. You have to think of sheep and goats as living, breathing economic investments. So choosing to eat them was a massive sacrifice of your future resources. Because of that, meat was reserved only for special hospitality, major festivals, or religious offerings. I mean, if you killed a sheep for dinner on just a random Tuesday, you were literally destroying your future supply of milk, cheese, and wool. No way would you do that. Therefore, everyday nutrition leaned heavily on grains, legumes, dairy, and olive oil. Meat was a true luxury. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how culinary traditions evolve over time. Take the command, "Do not boil a kid in its mother's milk." That phrase appears exactly 3 times in the entire Torah. Just 3. But over the centuries, later rabbinic Judaism took this incredibly specific, very short command and developed it into the complex modern separation of meat and dairy that we see today. The rules requiring totally separate utensils and storage systems. It's a massive evolution. Section 3, decoding the forbidden foods.
All right, now we get to treat Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14 a bit like a detective case to try and solve the mystery of these strange prohibitions. The Torah basically created strict culinary boundaries based on physical classifications. So for a land animal to be edible, it had to check two boxes. It had to chew the cud, and it had to have a split hoof. Boom, that instantly rules out the pig. For sea creatures, you needed both fins and scales, which meant absolutely zero shellfish. But while these boundaries were super strict, they also made some pretty strange exceptions, like they permitted certain types of locusts for consumption. Now, I know that sounds bizarre to a Western audience today, but it was actually a pretty standard practice in the ancient Near East.
But that brings up the most famous prohibition of all. Why was pork forbidden? Well, it is way too simplistic and, quite frankly, historically inaccurate to claim that ancient people banned pork because they somehow magically understood modern microbiology or bacteria. That is just not an established historical explanation at all. We really have to bust this anachronism that they understood modern hygiene. These food rules, and even their washing practices, were deeply tied to ritual classification, symbolism, and keeping social boundaries intact. When ancient texts talk about washing hands before a meal, that was all about achieving a state of ritual purity so you could eat sacredly. It wasn't about scrubbing away unseen germs. Now, to truly wrap our heads around this, we need to turn to archaeology, which essentially acts as our second sort of hidden cookbook. Section 4, Digging Up the Diet. You see, a biblical law written beautifully on a scroll and the actual historical implementation of that law in a dusty ancient kitchen, well, they aren't necessarily the same thing. The text tells us what the ideal rules were, but the archaeological dirt, the ancient cooking pots, the discarded bones in the trash heap, the olive presses, that dirt tells us what people were actually putting into their mouths on a daily basis. Historically speaking, we have to look at how this builds over time. For example, archaeologist Jonathan Adler's research argues that strong physical evidence for systematic, widespread kosher observance really only becomes visible around the 2nd century BCE. It's a really vital reminder for us. An ancient rule might exist in a text for centuries before we see massive, widespread archaeological proof that the entire population was actually out there rigorously practicing it. But by carefully sifting through those ancient cooking pots and bone fragments, historians can verify the text. The archaeological breakdown is fascinating. It reveals a huge abundance of grain and olive pits, plenty of permitted animal bones, and a very telling scarcity of pig remains in Judean settlements. That absence of pig bones, it's an incredible archaeological clue. It confirms that these dietary restrictions were in fact deeply woven into the everyday lives of these communities over time. And that brings us to the ultimate why behind the ancient Israelite diet. Section 5. Food as cultural identity. So, why all these rules in the first place? Well, the preparation of meat wasn't just standard butchery. The act of draining the blood transformed a completely mundane meal into a profound act of worship and respect for the divine. Because blood represented life itself, it simply couldn't be treated as ordinary food. Doing this elevated eating from a purely biological necessity into a daily, mindful, religious practice. I want you to really think about this idea for a second. The ancient Israelite kitchen was not just a place where simple meals of lentils and bread were cooked. No, it was the very place where their identity, their community, and their religious borders were forged. What they ate, and honestly, more importantly, what they strictly refused to eat, drew a definitive line in the sand. It separated them from the surrounding cultures, and it united them as one people. As we look back at these ancient culinary borders, it kind of leaves us wondering, doesn't it? What invisible rules are you following right now that tell the world exactly who you are? Because food is never just calories. It's history, it's economy, and it is identity. Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating topic with me in this explainer. Until next time, keep digging into the history around you.